The ceremony has its roots in the medieval university and serves multiple purposes. Firstly, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for the professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research. Thirdly, it stands out as a moment of pride and celebration for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and society. A celebration on the achievement of major milestones, contributions to the discipline, and ultimately the impact on society. So today we are gathered to bear witness to the entry of Professor Vally to the illustrious community of scholars at the university. This evening, we will listen to him as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not culminate once this lecture has been given. It is a self-reflective pause in the journey of the professor, with a promise of more to enrich our minds and simultaneously contributing to the rich intellectual body of work in the discipline. Prof, we are looking forward to your address. Prof. SARChI, I now invite you to introduce Prof. Vally to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Berger. Good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed my privilege to introduce Prof. Salim Vally. Salim Vally is the Director of the Centre for Education Rights and Transformation, the NRF SARChI Chair in Community, Adult and Workers' Education, and a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University. Now let me pause for a moment and indicate that I'm not going to read his full CV. You have it. I'm just going to give you some highlights. Salim studied at the Universities of York, Witwatersrand, and KwaZulu-Natal. After his return to South Africa in 1982, he taught at a secondary school in Eldorado Park and worked for literacy organizations in Johannesburg. From 1985 to 1994, he was the education officer for the Commercial Catering and Allied Workers Union of South Africa. He was employed at WITS University's Educational Policy Unit in 1995. In 2009, he co-established the Centre for Education Rights and Transformation at UJ. Prof. Vally's research looks beyond schools and classrooms and takes into account issues such as structural inequality, poverty, and forms of resistance to oppression and unequal material conditions in education and across society. And I think you would agree with me, extremely relevant also where we are today in our country. He has been at the forefront of developing a political economy approach towards conceptualizing education policy and education rights in South Africa, linking educational change to broader processes of economic, social, and political transformation. His praxis is embodied in the leitmotif of the research center he directs, reading the word and the world, changing the text and the context, flowing from Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. Salim's work on human rights in education has had national and international resonance. His key contribution has been to ground a conceptualization of rights in education within a contextualized analysis of community struggles over education in South Africa. The global impact of his work in this area has been crafted by his close working relationship with successive UN Special Rapporteurs on the right to education, and his close collaboration with leading international NGOs in the area of education rights and the 30 million strong education trade union, Education International. But Salim's work does not stop at critique, but he provides useful policy pointers for the South African government. Increasingly, a current in Salim's work is theorizing the education economy or economy relationship, and in particular the role of skills in development, as well as exploring the nexus between education and the triadic poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Salim has published widely, 7 books, 35 journal articles, and 33 chapters in peer-reviewed books. He agrees with Howard Zinn that most academics publish while others perish, and therefore continues his abiding interest in combining academic research with social intervention and creating synergy between socially engaged scholarship, community concerns, and global solidarity. And I think you would agree with me, he does this very successfully. Salim, we're looking forward to hearing your inaugural address.
Thanks, Professor Gravett, and thanks everyone for attending. It's really appreciated and makes me feel very warm inside here. Right at the outset, I have to acknowledge the presence of our late colleague, Madni Halim's immediate and extended family. For Wady and others, Cyril, Jesse, Rabia, thank you very much for coming. Kathy couldn't make it because she's observing 100 days since his passing. I would have consulted Madni about aspects of this talk, particularly issues such as community organizing and local livelihoods. And of course, he would insist on giving me a Madni-like joke. So really, his absence his presence is sorely missed. A deep sense of gratitude to the collective leadership at CERT, to Katlego, Mpumi, Linda, and Mondley, as well as all our students and our students-to-be in the chair. And I see a few of them have arrived, and I'm really glad about that. Researchers, our visiting professors, research associates, and colleagues in our faculty. I'm very glad that some of my ex-bosses, the worker leaders who belong to the union CAWE, are here. Mfana Futi, I see Herman, and officials like Jeremy and Kaiser Tiberi, as well as my friends in equal education. Somebody who cannot be here, but obviously would be very bemused by the pomp, ceremony, and generous display of honorifics is, of course, Neville Alexander. Well, Neville, I did succeed in changing the dress code on the invite from business formal to comfortable. But sorry about the hat and the gown I'm going to have to wear. It's much more daunting to change at the moment. Neville and I had a very intense political, educational, and intellectual relationship. We conspired and collaborated and failed, I must add, closely for almost 30 years. So I really also want to say immense gratitude and respect to Enver Motala and Linda Chisholm. Together with Neville, their formidable intellect has over really many years, I hope, projected on my mind some kind of Vygotskian zone of proximal development. I hasten to add the disclaimer that any blunders are really my own doing. Thanks also to all who came from afar. I see Mercia, Farrell, Darrell from Cape Town, other colleagues from Cape Town, colleagues from Eastern Cape, Sia Bulela, Erna, I saw Brian Ramadiro and Kim Porteous who just walked in, and all the way from the US, my partner, Carol Ann Spreen. Thrilled to have you all here, despite the carbon emissions we have all contributed to. As you know, our university has aspirations to be at the epicenter of the 4IR, so I hope my colleagues can develop some sort of teleporting device very soon, one that limits the carbon footprint, but more about 4IR later. Too many people, of course, to thank. I see my brother, my older brother is here, and of course, Noor, thanks for agreeing to respond. Forgive me if I haven't mentioned your name. I might not get to start with my presentation if I mention everybody's name. An inaugural lecture, I'm variously told, apart from the arcane traditions from medieval times that you've heard about, I'm told that it's a rite of passage, an occasion to narcissistically blow your own vuvuzela, and it formally bestows on you a license to profess. So clearly, I began professing those of you who know me, many decades ago, in an unlicensed kind of way. I prefer the advice that this significant occasion should be an opportunity to present one's body of research not just to the specialist, but a wide range of non-academic community. My paper is a very, very long one. That's why it's in such small, fine print, 30 pages long. But I'm told that, well, you have a copy. And in the time allocated to me, I can only speak to some of the key issues. Otherwise, I'll keep you here until midnight. Neville Alexander always mentioned the biblical axiom, where there is no vision, the people perish. Despite his missionary education, he was an avowed atheist, but he used the line from Proverbs 29 whenever he wanted to express indignation at the social malaise that he witnessed around him. In his last book, Thoughts on the New South Africa, he wrote, "Our real concerns are the palpable signs of social breakdown all around us, the ever more examples of greed and corruption involving public figures, expected to be the role models for our youth, the unspeakable abuse of children of the age and of women, the smug dishonesty, indiscipline and slothfulness of those who are paid to render public services, the unthinkable violence in so many communities, the abuse of drugs, in short, the general mayhem and apparently suicidal chaos that ordinary people experience in their daily lives." He lamented the fact that far from the cooperative, comradely ethos, we are enjoined to be like the entrepreneurial, individual whiz kids of the neoliberal era. The vision Alexander referred to existed while I was growing up politically in the stirring and fearless years of the 70s, including the watershed moment of the 76 uprising, certainly in the maelstrom years of the 80s, and even the expectant early 90s before this vision began to ebb away. In fact, as Enver and I wrote in Education, Economy and Society, all the South African educationists of the past that we venerate today, besides Neville Alexander, such as I.B. Tabata, Rick Turner, Ruth First, Archie Mafeje, Robert Mangaliso Sebukwe, Fatima Mir, Dennis Brutus, Matthew Goniwe, and I can go on, representing the diverse traditions in the liberation movement, had a very different vision of the society that exists today. And their legacy gave rise to vibrant and vital education social movements. They believed in a different kind of education, a purposeful education with values and beliefs that rebut race, gender, ethnic, and other stereotypes and scapegoating. And I'm thinking particularly about the disturbing events that we see around us in our city over the past few years. They also talked about the ability to evaluate ideas and systems critically, the ability to communicate socially and to work for oneself and one for society, and indeed also to stimulate intellectual curiosity, not the banal, reductive paradigm which is today the hallmark of the dominant approach, drowning out important ideas on education and society. Knowledge, skills, and competencies derived from education and training processes are really, of course, very critical and important for all societies and the well-being of all nations. However, the reduction of their values is a serious limitation on their social role. Now, South Africa has a very proud legacy of education for liberation, comprising a history of resistance in and through education. And this resistance generated popular epistemologies and pedagogies, including the people's education movement, workers' education, the popular adult and community education movements, education with production, amongst many others. And this is not, it's not self-indulgent nostalgia nor romance, but really to show that alternatives and possibilities arose out of those concrete engagements in social struggles. And in our book, a book that Aziz Chowdhury and I edited, Social Movements, Knowledge and Learning, mention is made of Svetlana Boym's distinction between critical or reflective nostalgia and a nostalgia that sees itself uncritically as truth and tradition, including nationalist myth-making. In the 80s up to the early 90s, the concept of education, in contrast to the apartheid education system, captured the imagination of many South Africans. And a significant influence on people's education were the ideas and methods of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Although the state banned Freire's books, hundreds of copied versions of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed were clandestinely distributed at black universities and eagerly studied by the young activists of the Black Consciousness movement. And the SASO students applied Freire's ideas and methods to many literacy and other conscientization projects in urban townships and rural areas. And Freire's anti-capitalist social theory accorded with the experience of and the insights at which education activists in the liberation movement had increasingly arrived at, and the situation out of which Freire's pedagogy had been formed in Brazil resembled that of South Africa. The specific organization of the struggle in the late 70s and especially in the 80s as a grassroots movement anchored in groups and projects in the community brought with it an exceptional sensitivity regarding democratic principles. From the mid-1980s, supporters of people's education were not only concerned with the transformation of schools, they also provided the impetus to the formation of hundreds of NGOs and also actively challenged academics and the academy. While the radical impetus of people's education prevailed throughout the better part of the 80s, liberal views on education gained cachet from the beginning of negotiations between the ANC and the apartheid regime in the 1990s. The discourse and content shifted substantially from demands which focused on societal engagement and democratizing power relations to one which emphasized outcomes, cost-effectiveness, and economic competitiveness. Similar to the invaluable education I received because of my activism in the South African student movement, and Ishmael Makabela and Sibongile, then Tembu, now Makabela, spent many time with us. We spent time at Wilgespreid, and I know Anjani, who was arrested. We were in Protea police station together. So I have to mention them because that education we received was very important. So too, my decade-long involvement with the union movement also left, like SARChI, an enduring and endearing impression on me. the educative role of social movements and social and political activism is often overlooked. In our recent book, History Schools, Aziz and I show that social movements are not only significant sites of social and political action, but also important, albeit contested and contradictory terrains of learning and knowledge production. Education intervention in the independent unions at that time was geared towards mass collective action and laying the basis for building strong democratic organization, providing the skills necessary for this, and it was not limited to the structured education program. In addition, the experience of building and controlling organizations collectively, as well as making independent decisions, had enormous educational value, as well as increasing the level of self-confidence amongst workers. Workers' education was not just the systematic education programs, nor even the extension of this through pamphlets, union newspapers, plays, and songs. The discourse of human rights and a developmental state and the incorporation of South Africa into a global market economy ruptured the counter-hegemonic principles and practices established in the 70s and the 90s, and I go into detail in my paper. Understanding these social processes will reveal how the education vision in the liberation movement formally and rhetorically co-opted and institutionalized did not translate into in reality into tangible benefits for the majority of the poor. The prevailing and misplaced assumption was that after the 1994 elections, the new political dispensation would automatically translate into a better society and an educational system. Most of the active participants in these education movements during apartheid were demobilized in the early 90s. Ballard shows that this phenomenon of demobilization is not unique, and Mamdani warns of the post-colonial marriage between technicism and nationalism, resulting in the demobilization of social movements. The initial hope for change from above was misplaced, and it took a number of years before social movements were reconstituted, spurred on by the neoliberal macroeconomic policies of the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy. Shortly after the first democratic elections, I was poached from the union movement into academia by the then director of the WITS University's Education Policy Unit, Professor Linda Chisholm. I'm not sure if she recalls, but in my very first act, having just heard Edward Said's Wreath lectures on the representations of the intellectual, was to place above my desk his famous lines concerning speaking truth to power. Of course, the poster accompanied me to UJ in 2009. My early work at the EPU involved convening the education leg of the Poverty and Inequality Hearings, an initiative of Chapter 9 organizations and civil society modeled on the TRC. And as the primary researcher on racism, racial integration, and desegregation, commissioned by the South African Human Rights Commission, and which involved over 100 schools. Both these endeavors provided compelling reasons why I have maintained in all my research output since an explicit focus on the relationships between power, knowledge, and the state in education, and the need to grapple with issues of class, race, gender, and spatial stratification in education and society. In essence, the report for the Human Rights Commission showed that the handling, of desegregation in most South African schools was firmly rooted within the assimilationist framework and a narrow multiculturalism. Many egregious instances of racism were found, but also that the shadow of apartheid ideology, I'm not sure if Nazir Karim is around, continued to cast its gloom not any longer through racially explicit policies, but by proxy and exclusion such as language restrictions, spatial segregation, and high fees. All of these things are related to social class. Although the report recommended 10 key concrete and achievable interventions. None of those were realized. The poverty and inequality hearings organized by Sangoko in '98 involved over 10,000 people who participated in the campaign by attending the hearings, mobilizing communities, or making submissions. These range from very carefully worded, logically argued views of research organizations to the poignant testimonies of the most marginalized. And the poor identified a range of obstacles preventing the eradication of poverty. At the conclusion of the nationwide hearings, the conveners arranged a list of responsibilities for government officials in order to ensure that the fight to end poverty becomes the nation's priority. Unfortunately, the hearings arrived at a cul-de-sac, and state officials' promises in the glare of the media, shall I add, Mersha, I think you were there, at the conclusion of the initiative did not materialize. My shift towards research on education rights, community participation, and transformation were related to my role as coordinator of the Education Rights Project, collaborating with the likes of Brian Ramadiro, Mondli Shlachwayo, Sarah Mota, and many others. During this time, I interacted with several hundred communities around various aspects of education rights. Many of these communities, assisted by the ERP, used participatory action research to strengthen their campaigns. The ERP also collaborated with public litigation organizations and others around specific issues such as the cost of education and user fees. Despite many unanswered questions, the experience of the ERP since 2002 has taught us following find that the thick desires to be educated and or to educate, to work in ways that are meaningful, to engage with politics, to be treated with respect, and to speak with voices that will be heard, exists in poor and working class communities in our country. We have also learned that the discourse of normative rights, championed as the mainstay of South Africa's public institutions and the Constitution, is limited if it is framed merely as a legal and justiciable phenomenon in affecting redress and equity. Sorry, lawyers in the audience. Acting as if certain rights exist for all in an equal way inhibits people's ability to recognize when they are in fact illusory and why society does not act to protect these rights. A single mother in one of South Africa's dusty townships or impoverished rural areas cannot be said to have the same power of political persuasion or opportunity compared to a suburban corporate executive. These are real distinctions that give some people advantages and privileges over others. So education rights cannot be divorced from socio-economic rights. Achieving curricular goals and the rights of citizens to a meaningful education will depend upon confronting, for example, patterns of inequality and social exclusion. It is also necessary to caution against an uncritical use of human rights instruments without applying them to pedagogical practice, an over-reliance on legal experts and ignoring the agency, struggles, and activism of rights claimants and holders. Legal mechanisms and human rights instruments must be understood within the larger realities of power and social relations. It is really easy to become despondent about the state of education when we read about practices involving rampant profligacy, the dismal state of infrastructure and facilities, as my equal education friends have shown in many of our schools, and I'm thinking here of people like the tragedy around Michael Komape and others, and the abysmal performance, really, of our learners. While a melange of new policies, official policies on every conceivable aspect of education exists, and racially based laws have been removed from the statutes, the education system as a whole reflects and reproduces the wider inequalities in society. Access to schooling has increased, and there is gender parity, but quality education for the vast majority of the population remains elusive. Although a minority of schools in South Africa can favorably compare with the best in the world, quality education remains unequally distributed along social class, racial, and spatial lines. Towards the end of 2008, some of us launched the Public Participation in Education Network, or PEN. Kim, you remember that. In its call to action, PEN declared that the failures evident in the education system had induced cynicism amongst various communities and even amongst educators, school managers, and other public officials. It warned that these sentiments would further entrench the sense of powerlessness and a loss of hope about the possibility of meaningful outcomes for society as a whole. PEN asserted that the schools were not failing individually, rather the nation was failing them collectively. Alexander discussed ways of reversing this trend and identified a few key omissions and mistakes, including the failure to move away from the spatial apartheid location of schools, which perpetuates racial and class divisions, the inadequate professional development of teachers, and the blind spot of language policy in schools. But besides Alexander, a number of educationists, including some in this chambers, have written about the problems besetting the post-apartheid education system. They include writings on educational management, school governance, curriculum, language, assessment, equity, teacher education, professional development, sport, early childhood development, and I can go on and on. Early on, we realize that education, while a necessary condition, cannot on its own address the social problems of our society. Our society has to confront. Education is not a panacea. And the patent failure of the public education system to provide quality education for the majority of learners has spawned a number of atavistic suggestions to change the situation, including, and this is really dangerous, the crude resort to an apartheid-like disciplinary regime and the privatization of education. We also have a dangerous situation where failure by the state to implement its own policies has resulted in many incorrectly blaming what they consider as an all-too-powerful human rights culture for undermining discipline and respect for authority as they understand it. This often involves, for example, the nostalgic call for a return to authoritarianism characterized by the fundamental pedagogics of didactic and choral recitation, talk and chalk, rote learning, corporal punishment and blaming teachers and learners, and not systemic inequality for educational shortcomings. There's a lot I can say about teacher unions, and Godfrey and I have had discussions, but we'll save that for a later time. While self-discipline and accountability to the community is essential, I must remember not to ad-lib too much. Learner-centered practices need not undermine, but could instead enhance respect and self-discipline in the classroom. Many of our schools are grey, bleak, fearful, and depressing places that stifle creativity. It does not have to be this way. The joy of learning does not contradict the importance of self-discipline, rigor, and hard work. Frere's advice to learners and educators combining the cognitive with the affective is useful. He said, they should never confuse this happiness of a joyful school with the easy happiness of not doing. It is not necessary to make the tables any more rigid than the hardness that wood gives them. It is not necessary to harden the posture of the children. It's not necessary to put a collar and tie on the child so that she, already suffering, can learn. Certainly not. But on the other hand, things can't be loosened to such an extent that the child gets lost just in the toy, just in being happy. Focusing on OBE, which was introduced as an incredibly complex and grandiose curricular approach, and the focus on outcomes, help create a climate where the only things that matter are those you can measure. There was the view that teachers in poorer communities had to be creative in mustering additional resources and inventing alternatives. But without adequate training and resources to sustain their initiatives, This was akin to providing teachers with a lamp and 3 wishes. Thus, as Caroline and I wrote, thus ironically, OBE largely benefit teachers in well-resourced schools. South Africa has very high rates of child poverty. According to UCT's Children Institute, 65% of children live below the upper bound poverty line. So although prolific in quantity and rich in their theoretical and analytical contributions, many volumes of educational analysis leave a major gap in understanding policy in practice. Regardless of how enlightened a curriculum might be or teachers motivated, none of this will matter if a child comes to the classroom hungry. By obscuring this simple reality, we miss the real issue. There are those who complain that we are not getting bang for our buck, spending too much money on education without the requisite returns. It is true that much of the money from our fiscus does not reach the intended beneficiaries, and it is not simply a question of throwing money at the problem. Wastage and corruption must be addressed. But today, the vast majority of our public schools do not have proper, adequate functioning libraries. Many are overcrowded, and there's a huge backlog of buildings, capital expenditure, and school maintenance. And I'm not going to quote an OECD report, it's in the paper, but it shows that we don't spend more money relative to other countries, given our demography and the age group of our young people. I won't go into the details. Besides the illusion of social class analysis, my body of work examines the role of local education activism in South Africa, a relatively under-researched area largely ignored by mainstream education policy theorists. Also, I argue that education reforms that seek to address social cleavages should be accompanied by a wider range of redistributive strategies, democratic participation, political will, and clear choices about the social ends policy interventions seek to achieve. Excuse me. Grappling effectively with contemporary education problems requires bringing issues of class and community back to the forefront in theorizing and understanding education policy in the South African context. Apart from Linda Chisholm's book, Changing Class, scant attention is paid directly to issues of social class in education over the past 25 years. Elsewhere, in an article on class, race, and state in post-apartheid education, Enver and I made clear that throughout the period of the 70s up to the 90s, debate about class analysis characterized really a vast array of writings, including historical studies, sociology, political science, and political economy analysis in particular. We regretted the fact that social class as an analytical and conceptual category has been a casualty of the anti-apartheid period. And we wrote, postmodern theory in vogue during this period was used as a justification for the retreat from class, made even more seductive by its coincidence with the illusionary miracle of the new South Africa. It could be argued that intellectuals in South Africa have themselves been complicit in the erasure of class as an analytical category, quite often consciously and disparagingly. There is also the possibility of timidity in the face of the avalanche of academic and public voices representing capital, which have made any reference to class seem both archaic and ideological, as though those voices are themselves not ideological. In our view, this is consistent with the decline of scholarship, which represented the strength of such analysis, itself a victim of the self-censorship imposed by scholars on any work that overtly recognize the importance of social class. This is not meant to imply that racial and gender issues are mere distractions from issues of inequality. Lest I am misunderstood, the view of the Trinidadian CLR James quoted in Walter Rodney's seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is apposite here. He said, the race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race alone is disastrous. But to neglect the racial factor as merely incidental is an error only less grave than to make it fundamental. Indeed, it is precisely because racist policies and strategies have come to be used in societies, both for capital accumulation and for engendering social conflict, and by the ruling class of global hegemonic states like the US to advance their global exploitative interests, that ideas about race and other such discursive categories have such powerful meanings in the public consciousness, in global politics, and ultimately in the control over resources. Grappling with the relationship, what Neville used to call an ancient debate, grappling between these social categories is not limited to South Africa. John Saul writes, Himani Banerjee has underscored the absurdity of attempting to see identity and difference as historical forms of consciousness unconnected to class formation, development of capital and class politics. But in doing so, she has also emphasized the impossibility of considering class itself outside the gendering and racing that so often significantly characterizes it in the concrete. Now, moving towards the pedagogies of possibilities, there are a number of false solutions. Privatization of education is one. And policymakers and analysts in South Africa are wont to borrow policies and their prescriptions largely from Europe and North America, regardless of the vastly differing histories, contexts, and circumstances. In effect, although many of the borrowed policies have been shown to be ineffective in the very countries of their provenance, they continue to be purveyed as policies useful to development elsewhere. Such policy borrowing is fostered, regrettably, not only through the work of expert consultants, but also by native researchers who have little regard for the critical literature on this issue. South Africa has seen a mushrooming of private schools in recent years. I provide details of this trend in my paper, but also how hundreds of millions of public monies subsidize private schools. I also look in my paper in the details about the adverse consequences of privatization. But for now, Cleese's caution is apposite, and it's also true for South Africa. 30 plus years of neoliberal policies have often left public schools overcrowded, with poorly trained teachers, few learning materials, dilapidated facilities, and often not close by. It is no wonder that some parents opt out. However, while it is rational for disadvantaged individuals to sometimes send their children to private schools, and I'm not one for moralizing about this issue, it is poor public policy. It serves only a few. It increases inequality. It ignores the public interest. It neglects public schools, and it devalues teachers. Privatization is said to meet the growing education gap, which resulted from years of attack on the public sector. But all it does is replace an attempt to develop good public policy with the vagaries of charity or the narrow-mindedness of profit-making. We simply cannot abandon the public mandate of the state if we are to have any hope of achieving a society free of corruption, accountable public services promoting decent employment and socially useful work, the provision of public goods, and the development of a genuinely democratic society. And for public education to work, we need motivated, professional, and happy educators, competent managers and state officials, adequate resources and infrastructure, a conducive community environment, addressing the social context and the consequences of poverty, and proper enforcement of standards. The corporate agenda is not limited to schools, and our forthcoming book, Universities and Social Justice, Aziz and I discuss the trend in universities around the world. Here I'll merely mention the issues in broad outline. Universities also are confronted by renewed privatization, intensive marketization, and a challenge to the very notion of the university as a mechanism for addressing social inequality and facilitating the circulation of knowledge. The late Toni Morrison presciently and lyrically counseled some time ago during her Nobel Prize acceptance speech that there will be more of the language of surveillance disguised as research, of politics and history calculated to render the suffering of millions mute, arrogant pseudo-empirical language crafted to lock creative people into cages of inferiority and hopelessness, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science. It is the language that laps vulnerabilities, tucks its fascist boots under the crinolines of respectability and patriotism as it moves relentlessly towards the bottom line and the bottomed-out mind. It cannot permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. And in the face of mass unemployment, aligning skills to the competitive global new knowledge economy has become the obsession not only of ours, but many nation states. Solidarity and learning that addresses the self to public life and social responsibility to robust public participation and democratic citizenship is marginalized. Subjects and disciplines that have a purchase in the marketplace instead are valued highly. My colleague here, Rasigan Maharaj, has contributed to the critical debate about 4IR and has provided a number of insights. And many universities, not only UJ, ardently promote 4IR. For those who don't know, by the way, sorry, it's the fourth industrial revolution. I believe that while technology and the development of technological skills are really important, Bell cautions, but not within the existing economic system and the political and social framework that sustain it. We also need to equip students to ask critical questions, including about the political economy of technology itself and the pedagogical and social implications of educational technology, which they can only do through critical consciousness to engage in democratic debate on this important issue and to make informed choices about social priorities. Now, undoubtedly, progressive spaces, while constrained, do exist in the academy. If they didn't exist, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. And individuals in many universities are able to connect with community organizations and social movements and accomplish valuable counter-hegemonic work. They, of course, must be expanded through a vigorous defense of higher education as a public good and a sphere of critical democratic citizenry, and resistance against commercial and corporate values that shape the form, purpose, and mission of our institutions. The emphasis on technical rationality, simplistic pragmatism, and undemocratic managerial imperatives must be countered. Proactively, initiatives should include linking programs, projects, and resources. Now, there are a legion of commentators, largely employed by financial institutions, that tediously feed us a daily diet of market fundamentalism through the print and electronic media. You hear it every day. Their mantra is usually a permutation of the following cliches. We must be competitive and entrepreneurial. Education fails to provide young people with skills for employment. We need more investment and economic growth. I can go on. Rarely do we hear dissenting voices, and the simplistic statements and the platitudes of these experts are seldom challenged. In the situation of mass unemployment and inequality, this preemptive discourse is seductive, playing as it does into the anxieties and ambitions of both parents and young people who want a job. And the seemingly common sense approach places the burden of responsibility squarely on individuals and their deficit. Following Gramsci, these shared views cohere into everyday wisdom, and is seen and relies on some degree of consent. Relatedly, Beatty, in a significant recent article on neoliberalism's psychological effects titled "The Road to Psychopathology, Neoliberalism and the Human Mind," revealingly begins his article with an epigram attributed to Margaret Thatcher, who allegedly said, "Economics are sick. The method, the object is to change the heart and the soul." Pankaj Mishra, Enver told me a few days ago, in his book The Age of Anger, also deals with the same issue. I'm coming towards a closure. The cause of unemployment in general is put at education's door, more broadly arguing that education is not teaching what the economy needs. It is unfortunately true that many children and youth in South Africa leave school without the basic skills necessary for life and work. But the mismatched discourse is usually less about basic skills and more about vocational skills. The argument, while superficially plausible, is not true for at least two reasons. First, vocational skills, which are often context-specific, are best taught on the job. Secondly, unemployment is not a worker skill supply problem, but a structural problem of capitalism. While focusing on education institutions and the supply side, the more important question is the demand side one, usually ignored by human capital theorists, regarding how can we create decent jobs that require valuable skills and value education outside work. Quite often people have the skills, but there are no jobs. Siyabulela Mama, his recent article on the skills mismatch argument in the Amandla magazine is pertinent, particularly his discussion of alternatives such as solidarity economies, cooperatives, and climate justice job. That's partly what our new chair, or what I prefer calling our SOFA, intends to do. And it's the chair on community, adult, and worker education. So moving towards closure, today, besides facing an unprecedented ecological crisis brought about by unbridled capitalist exploitation of our planet, Moore calls it the Capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene, progressive struggles must contend with other serious challenges as the latest wave of nationalist, racist, and pseudo-populist politics to divide and rule communities and countries already fractured by years of social and economic upheaval, repression, and growing inequality. These political agendas divert attention away from the real causes of today's social and economic problems. An unjust world is not inevitable. We are often accosted with a demand to produce an alternative or an emphatic "there is no alternative" argument. The riposte to this is Temba. There must be an alternative, also hope in the Nguni languages. Or tapas. There are plenty of alternatives. The praxis of all the social movements I mentioned earlier gave rise to many possibilities, which, although often tentative, could have been developed further. In some cases, clear alternatives were squandered, and I give a few examples. Several implications flow from the points I've raised in my paper as they relate to unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Moreover, the alternatives suggested relative to work and learning should be consistent with progressive ways of thinking about sustainable planetary ecology. Given the urgency of dealing with climate change, an eco-pedagogy is also necessary. And those fixated solely on technological possibilities, please take heed. For the journal Nature, in order to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius would require 10 new carbon capture plants to open every week for 70 years. There are currently 18 plants worldwide. In the meantime, the UN thinks that by 2050, there will be at least 200 million climate refugees, and in the worst case scenario, 1 billion. The poorest countries, which have caused the least pollution, will bear the brunt of the suffering, and already do. The pressure of competitiveness, marketing, and the seduction to own the latest car, the biggest house, the temptations of conspicuous consumption is not helped by the example of yesterday's struggle icons. And Mandla has written, very lyrically about this in his novels. How can educators empower young people to see through the deception and glitz or bling, to see the values of solidarity, justice, the fight against discrimination, and equality as the primary ones? How can educators open students to the possibilities that there may be more fulfillment to be discovered in living in a just society, where, as Neville argued, enough is as good as a feast, than living in an arrantly inequitable, insecure one, where we have to build higher and higher walls? How can we help to recognize the violations in the continued violence against women, children, LGBTI plus people, and those we deem foreign, scapegoated because of politicians' incompetence? As I speak, the politicians' Jeremiads against foreigners have been ramped up, while parts of Joburg, Tshwane, and other places burn. Paulo Freire calls on us to imagine a world that is less ugly, more beautiful, less discriminatory, more democratic, less dehumanizing, and more humane. Macedo writes in his introduction to the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo teaches us in the world with his hallmark humility what it means to be an intellectual. As always, he teaches us with his penetrating and unquiet mind the meaning of a profound commitment to fight social injustices in our struggle to recapture the loss of our dignity as human beings. We need to say no to the neoliberal fatalism, embrace history as possibility, where we can demystify this perverse fatalism that characterizes the neoliberal discourse. To end, in forging meaningful alternatives and possibilities for education today means we often have to look back. I've just read a book titled Under-Education in Africa, From Colonialism to Neoliberalism by Karim Hirji. The book recounts how after independence, students together with some progressive staff members, such as Walter Rodney, it's about Tanzania, John Saul and others contributed to making the University of Dar es Salaam a beacon of progressive scholarship. They championed decolonization, and while critically supportive of President Nyerere's, and I think Salima has published, Daraja Press that have published this book, her anthology of poems are there as well. While they were supportive of President Nyerere's humanism and policies of Ujamaa, they also warned of the dangers of neocolonialism. Their critiques, celebrated as the Dar es Salaam debates, remain germane to revitalizing the African Academy today. In these bleak, dire, and precarious times, with constant assaults on reason and education for liberation, the book is an antidote to despair. Hirji's injunction not to lose hope is also a clarion call to action and a firm belief that the struggle is a long-term one. There are bound to be ups and downs, but ultimately, Africa and its people will triumph. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Salim. That was fantastic. I was given very clear instructions by the administrator that I have exactly 7 minutes. As an historian who was able to bend time, I'd like to think I have 420 seconds. So first of all, thank you very much, Salim, for the privilege to speak at your inaugural lecture. You haven't said so, but it's a cause for great celebration, both personal and as well as we can see from the people who are here, in broader communities of activists, of comrades, scholars, friends and family. It marks another milestone in an illustrious life of one of South Africa's leading educationists, of a radical pedagogue. I know from having had conversations with you that this moment also generates some discomfort. The idea of being celebrated at the university and to be inaugurated into this club of the Professoriate does cause discomfort, but I think it is a positive discomfort. It's a dissenting discomfort, because unlike many of our academics, being included into this illustrious club is not the apex of your career. It makes this achievement, this one moment, this one step, in my mind, even more remarkable for one of South Africa's leading public intellectuals. Having read the paper and having thought about what I should say, I was left with an enormous dilemma. How does one kind of encapsulate in my still remaining 7 minutes a kind of rich life, a very deep and reflective paper? And there's an embarrassment of riches on which to draw. And I was wondering, what does one do? Because any number of signposts that one could, from your life, that one could draw on. We could kind of recall the laity from Fitas, Lenasia, Johannesburg, the African continent, Palestine, the Americas, Salim as a global citizen. I could focus on your life as a SASM activist, a political prisoner, an activist in Action Youth, the National Forum, WOZA, CAWE, CUSATU, the Anti-Privatization Forum, and various social movements in the democratic era, as well as various Palestine solidarity campaigns. Or one could focus on your role as a high school learner, a high school educator. You work at Learn and Teach. You work as a union education officer, as a university researcher, and as a supervisor. In all of these, for those of us who've known you for a number of years, and some longer than others, you have been able, in a very exemplary way, to seamlessly move between these different categories. Because in fact, they have not represented separate categories of activism and of being a pedagogue. So as an activist, a critical pedagogue, a researcher, I'd like to offer some comments. At the end, though, I do want to offer one thing which has not come up in your wonderful presentation, and that is your more recent title as a grandfather. But more about Tariq later. Okay? A central tenet of Salim's work has been precisely your ability to combine radical ideas and praxis. And very often people speak about this, but they don't embody it. It's something to present in papers, to make claims about. What your life has embodied thus far, and no doubt on your new sofa will continue to embody, is precisely that kind of critical embodiment of radical ideas and radical practice, because the two are inseparable, and you've proven that they have been inseparable. Salim's work has consistently criticized, as he writes in his paper, the erroneous view that education should be reduced to the demands and vicissitudes of the market. By contrast, both his theoretical corpus and his activism has insisted on the inextricable connection between education, social justice, and democracy. These are principles which don't only come from reading, although they have, particularly from the scholars who we've mentioned, but also they were forged in struggle. And throughout reading your paper, I was looking for the S word, okay? Because we have social justice and democracy. But I think that what you want to say, and we can mention it in this kind of haloed space, what you mean is socialism, okay? It's both anti-capitalist and it is socialist. Following in the footsteps of Neville Alexander, Salim's contributions to collective endeavors, and I think the collective is critically important, because this moment here is about the individual. And I think it needs to be about the individual. When one celebrates these moments, we don't sufficiently give attention to both of those, acknowledging your individual brilliance, but also understanding, in your case, how attentive you've been to collective endeavors. These collective endeavors have, over many years, following the work of Neville and others, have generated popular, as you say, epistemologies and pedagogies that shine through. And these were forged in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in what was then the People's Education Movement, and for 10 years, but I think even before and certainly beyond that, also in worker education in the trade unions. But these were spaces that were never, as I said earlier, kind of clearly demarcated. It's not as if when you were working with Kaiser in CAWE that you were not involved in community activities, in schools, in popular education, and so on. It's important to remember these activities tonight, because they occurred both in formal spaces and informal settings. And in the official narratives, the official accounts of the struggle for a new education system, these experiences have often been elided and deliberately undermined by those who want to promote themselves rather than give voice to the efforts by people like yourself and thousands of others who built a different, more radical pedagogy. Neville Alexander looms large in your work, as does Paulo Freire and many other radical pedagogues. Freire's anti-capitalist social theories and his pedagogical method of combining education with conscientizing and politicizing has been critically important, and that shines through both, again, your ideas and your praxis. These ideas, as you've indicated, were developed in your formative years in the black consciousness and further developed in the trade union movement. What I'd like to do in the 420 seconds I have left is to focus on one salient thread in your work. And I think it centers around the idea of class. But class with its multiple meanings. Class, as in classroom, a place where education happens, but also as a site of intense contestation. But class not confined to the formal institutions. Class as an analytical concept, and class as agency. From your early years, class was a space, a site of learning, also challenging conventions, and thus a site of contestation and the development of emancipatory possibilities. It was here, both at school and outside school, that a vision of liberating education developed in the heat of struggle, where the boundaries between the formal institution, the classroom, and the community was deliberately broken down, albeit metaphorically. The struggle became, importantly, as you note in your recent book with Aziz Chowdhury, the struggle itself became a classroom. And often this is forgotten. People imagine the classroom is a space, a confined space with four walls where education happens. And in your book with Aziz on history schools, which I think is a remarkable intervention on the history of social movements, on the history of struggle, the two of you, with scholars from across the world, demonstrate the significant role of movements as producers of knowledge, as having a profoundly educational role, and also as places where history was made and history was produced. In the 1980s, trade union education played a key role. It was, as you recount in a paper, these were classrooms of radical ideas, but they were not just about politics. Literacy was critically important, and therefore the learn and teach experience came in very powerfully in how education occurred in the trade unions. They were also, following the traditions of the independent trade unions, they were independent spaces of democratic practice. You were part of a collective, and I want to emphasize this, but influential. We know this from the work that's being done now around the history of the socialist collective. Also a very influential figure in shaping the education program in CAWE. Modest to a fault, as you always are, what you don't say is how the experience in CAWE, together with other people, also influence education programs in the rest of the trade union movement. As you say in your paper, and I think it's critically important, the trade unions, not only the education programs, were classes. This is where real education happened. They occurred in the trade union offices, they occurred during strikes, they occurred during sit-ins. The idea of the classroom was, from your days at high school in the 1970s, always expanding outwards and always being inclusive in order to make it democratic and contentious spaces. From a current vantage point, and particularly maybe for the younger generation, it's difficult to recall and perhaps understand how these movements in the 1980s proliferated. It was a period of creativity, not only of political contestation, new ideas were developed. Crucially, these movements developed both the ideas and practices that in contemporary parlance would be called the decolonization of universities. Not to say that the issues being raised today are not interesting or new, but it's a previous history that the current movements can learn from, again, through the activism and scholarship of people like yourself. Because what did that movement call for? It called for universities to be accountable, for universities to relate, not as outreach to communities, but to be fundamentally integrated in the life and the work of those communities. To break down, where I come from down the road, we have a green barrier that keeps people out. Okay? In the 1980s, we called for those to be removed, for the separation between the ivory towers and the people just down the road to be dismantled. It also called that kind of the work that Salim and others undertook, called for curriculum transformation centered on the principles of people's education. I think it's really important to note that these ideas animated the movements of the 1980s. And there was hope in the early 1990s, as in many, many disciplines, including my own discipline and in education, that the ideas that animated those movements would also inform policy and practice. And often these ideas found their way, the words found their way, the rhetoric found their way into policy. So when you read policy, you can perhaps imagine Salim Vally's voice, Enver Mothala, Linda's voices there. But in practice, of course, hope was diminished, hope was destroyed. As with many aspirations of freedom that emanated from the struggles of the 70s and 80s, education founded on the rocks of South Africa's homegrown neoliberal project. Many people, including Salim's work, has shown that the consequent emphasis in education that was placed on outcomes, on cost effectiveness, on economic competitiveness has had dire consequences for the vast majority. Amidst the euphoria that captivated the country in the transition, deeper processes unfolded that would, as we now know, have deleterious consequences for the majority. Critics like Salim came under heavy criticism. They were ostracized. And as the possibilities in the early mid-1990s of the classes that were created in the 1980s narrowed considerably, Salim was able to shift some of his and increasingly more attention to a different terrain, the class of the tertiary institution of universities. Here, he has been a prolific researcher. His research has focused on the relationship, amongst others, between power, knowledge, and the state, and the need to grapple with the issues of class, race, and gender. His research has shown, as he's explained, that the formal desegregation in our schools was firmly rooted, as he argues, in the assimilationist framework perpetuated by our contemporary system. He has focused on questions around the right to basic education and critiquing legislative frameworks. Work that is done, in my mind, that is critically important. I've got 2 pages. I'm very wary of the time. I'm going to rush now, okay? In my mind, what has been critically important is that together with people like Linda and Monley, Salim and his colleagues at SARChI have been able to work at the coalface, at the intersection of policy, of research, of activism, and remarkably, because I'm completely incapable of doing this, the public sector, education departments. I'm completely amazed how someone who is known throughout the public sector as a sharp critic of that system is able to be engaged with continuously and whose advice is sought on policy. And I think it speaks volumes to the work that you, Linda, Mondley, and other colleagues have done at SARChI to maintain it as a space of critical intellectual activity, of community activism, and simultaneously be able continuously to engage in the world of policy. Importantly, and I think your book on history schools demonstrates that international comparative dimensions to our work is critically important. And I think that your standing as a global scholar has allowed that kind of intellectual engagement to be brought more centrally into the work of SARChI and has enriched profoundly our own understanding of South Africa's location in global education problems. Finally, on the question of class, and I can summarize this because you have eloquently spoken about these issues, is a question of class analysis, which I think has been central to Salim's intellectual and political labor. Always attentive to the centrality of racism in education and beyond, Salim has argued that it is inextricably linked to power relations, and it is reproduced in conjunction with class, gender, and other forms of inequality. As Salim has indicated, poverty and inequality undermine education. And in South Africa, the majority of children who are black suffer as a consequence of the neoliberal policies being pursued by the government. His work has consistently and sharply offered a rebuttal of liberal discourses that have attempted to examine education separated from this wider economic, political, social, and cultural context. By contrast, Salim's writing underscores the centrality of class, the intersection with race, what again in contemporary parlance we would call intersectionality. Perhaps people of our generation who could speak about the articulation of exploitations and oppression. Maybe it means the same thing, maybe not. What shines as a beacon in Salim Vally's contribution is his capacity, in my mind, to always combine his academic work, his kind of formal intellectual work, with activism. It's about constantly creating the connections between struggles that take place in the universities, outside the communities, and the intellectual work that is not abstracted from that world, not abstracted from the real struggles of people, but is used to, in fact, influence and to sharpen those struggles against various forms of oppression and exploitation. In the last 3 years, in the context of Fees Must Fall, Salim has been one of those important voices which has been critically sympathetic to the student movement, critical of the administrations, critical of the state, for undermining the possibility of a proper decolonial African university. His work has shown how universities, like schools, have become commodified, where students are clients, and staff, academics, and administration staff have to serve clients, and demands are made as a consequence of those commodified relations. Salim has indicated that he has read Karim Hiraji's book, which I think is really fantastic. The only point I want to make in addition, I'm not going to repeat what you've said here, I think that the kind of pan-African vision that came from places like Dar, from Maputo and elsewhere, speak powerfully not only to the possibility of what we as Africans can achieve in developing ideas and practices, but they're also a powerful antidote to the current violence and xenophobia that confronts us. Neville Alexander and many comrades spent their lives fighting for an emancipated Africa. Professor Salim Vally's work was forged in these experiences of hope and now stands as a critical intervention of what has gone wrong, and importantly, what is to be done to build and generate educational ideas and praxis for socialism. I had written here social justice and democracy, but I'm editing myself as I go on. So over the weekend I was in Cape Town. This is my final comment. Over the weekend I was in Cape Town. As one does in Cape Town, you walk into shopping centers. You don't go up the mountain, you don't go to the beach, okay? And I very happily bumped into Dr. Natasha Vally, whose brilliance and passion she gets from her parents. She was with her partner Emily and their son Tariq, who I hadn't met before. So Natasha tells Tariq, this is Grumpy's friend. And I was told immediately that Grumpy does, as we know, does not refer to Salim's personality. But it is Tariq's evolution of names that will eventually, I think, get to something like Grampy rather than Grumpy. Very importantly, when Natasha said to Tariq, this is Grumpy's friend, Tariq immediately broke out into a giggle. He was smiling from ear to ear. And it's really with that broad smile and that love that Tariq has shown that we want to convey congratulations, love and admiration to your wonderful achievement. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Prof. Noor, for that excellent response, giving us also a perspective on the importance of the work that Prof. Vally is doing with his co-workers, about the scope and about the journey and the challenges that you also had to overcome. So thank you very much for that. Prof. Vally, thank you so much for a thought-provoking, inspiring, sharing your journey with us lecture. And that journey is so interlinked with the journey of South Africa. And you raised so many challenges, and you pointed out that there are so much work still to be done. And for that, I think, you have only started your journey, perhaps. There's so much work to be done between you and your co-workers. But I'm grateful that you ended up with hope, with Temba, because that's what we believe as we continue the work here, that if universities play their role, and not only at UJ, but as a collective, that we are actually the hope for the future, making sure that the basic education, as you also pointed out, that we overcome the challenges there, and also in secondary education. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, only a glimpse of the important work you are doing, and all the very best with your work going forward. So thank you very much. And now we invite you to come for the gown. You can do the hat for us. For the other part. Well.